The hollow wind. The wind howled through the desolate canyon, carrying with it an eerie wail that seemed to belong to neither the living nor the dead. The vast desert stretched out under a sky that was darkening to a bruised purple, the last traces of daylight slipping behind jagged cliffs. The land was ancient here, filled with secrets older than the bones buried beneath the red earth. And tonight, it would reveal one of those secrets. Jake Morgan shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his horse pawing nervously at the ground. He wasn't a superstitious man, but something about this place had unsettled him from the moment he and his brother Adam had crossed into Navajo territory. They had come seeking lost cattle, but now, as dusk fell over the canyon, Jake wished they had turned back hours ago. "We shouldn't be here," Adam said, his voice low as he rode up beside Jake. His eyes scanned the shadowy cliffs, his usual cocky demeanor gone. "This place feels wrong." Jake glanced at his younger brother, surprised to see fear in his eyes. Adam was rarely spooked by anything. They'd ridden through storms, faced off against wolves, and dealt with more than a few rough men in their time, but this was different. "Let's just find the cattle and head home," Jake replied, though he couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. He wanted to be out of this canyon as much as Adam did, but the thought of leaving their herd behind wasn't an option. Times were hard, and every head of cattle mattered. The brothers urged their horses deeper into the canyon, their eyes sweeping the shadows for any sign of movement. But the wind made everything seem alive. The way it stirred the sagebrush, the soft rattling of dead leaves on twisted trees, the whispering of something unseen just beyond the rocks. "Jake," Adam said after a long silence, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you remember the stories Grandma used to tell us?" Jake frowned, pulling his hat lower against the biting wind. "About what?" "Skinwalkers," Adam muttered, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. "She used to say that these lands were cursed, that there were things here that didn't follow the laws of man or nature." Jake let out a short, derisive laugh, though it sounded forced even to his own ears. "Grandma told a lot of stories to scare us as kids. Ain't no such thing as skinwalkers. Just superstitious nonsense." Adam didn't respond, but Jake could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested nervously on the rifle slung across his saddle. The silence between them thickened, broken only by the wind that seemed to whisper and sigh, tugging at their nerves. They rode in silence for what felt like hours, though the fading light made it hard to tell how much time had passed. The canyon walls closed in around them, towering cliffs casting deep, jagged shadows. The air grew colder, sharper, as if the very land was holding its breath. Suddenly, Adam's horse reared up with a terrified whinny, nearly throwing him to the ground. Adam struggled to calm the animal, his face pale and tight with fear. "What the hell?" Jake began, but his own horse began to fidget, its ears flattening against its head. The hair on the back of Jake's neck stood on end. There was something out there, something watching them. He could feel it, like a pair of unseen eyes tracking their every movement. "Did you hear that?" Adam whispered, his voice trembling. Jake listened, his heart pounding in his chest. At first he heard nothing but the wind, but then there it was, a soft rustling sound, like something moving through the brush. Not an animal, something bigger and closer. "Probably just a coyote," Jake muttered, though he didn't believe his own words. Coyotes didn't cause horses to act like this. The rustling grew louder, coming from the cliffs above them. Jake squinted into the twilight, searching for the source of the noise. His hand tightened around the grip of his rifle. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, something darting between the rocks, too fast to be an animal, too fluid to be a man. It was as if the shadows themselves were moving, bending around the figure that seemed to glide across the rocks. "Jake," Adam's voice was barely audible now, filled with dread. "We need to go, now." But before Jake could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed through the canyon, reverberating off the stone walls. It wasn't like any animal Jake had ever heard. It was deep, primal, filled with a kind of malevolence that made his blood run cold. Without thinking, Jake swung his rifle off his shoulder and aimed it toward the sound. His hands shook, though whether from the cold or from fear, he wasn't sure. "Show yourself," Jake shouted into the growing darkness, his voice trembling slightly. The growl came again, closer this time. The horses stamped nervously, their eyes wide with terror. Jake could feel the fear radiating off of Adam, could hear his brother muttering prayers under his breath. And then, it appeared. At first Jake thought it was a man, tall, gaunt, with a body wrapped in animal skins. But as it moved closer, stepping into the dim light of the dying sun, Jake's stomach lurched. The thing had the shape of a man, but its eyes were wrong, too large, too dark, reflecting no light. Its face was twisted, almost wolf-like, with sharp teeth that gleamed in the fading light. Its limbs were too long, its movements too unnatural. A skinwalker. Jake had heard the stories, heard about the Navajo witches who could shift into animals, who could take the form of men and beasts alike, using dark magic to feed their insatiable hunger for power. But he had never believed them. Not really. Now, as the creature stood before him, its breath steaming in the cold night air, Jake realized with a sinking dread that the stories had been true all along. The creature's lips curled back in a snarl, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. Its eyes, cold and empty, locked onto Jake's. "Run!" Jake shouted, snapping out of his paralysis. He fired his rifle, the sound of the shot echoing through the canyon like thunder. The bullet hit the creature square in the chest, but it barely flinched. Adam kicked his horse into motion, and the animal bolted down the canyon, hooves pounding the earth. Jake fired again, this time aiming for the creature's head, but it was too fast. With an inhuman speed, it leapt to the side, disappearing into the shadows. Jake's horse reared, its eyes rolling back in terror. He gripped the reins, trying to regain control, but the beast was panicking. It bucked wildly, throwing Jake to the ground with a bone-jarring thud. He gasped, the wind knocked from his lungs. He scrambled to his feet, pain shooting through his ribs. But there was no time to think about that now. He could hear the creature's growl, could feel its presence closing in on him. Jake grabbed his rifle from where it had fallen and took off running, his legs burning as he sprinted after Adam. He could hear his brother shouting his name, but the canyon distorted the sound, making it seem like it was coming from all directions. The wind howled around him, carrying with it the scent of something foul, like rotting meat. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps as he ran, his heart pounding in his chest. Behind him the growling grew louder, closer. Jake turned, raising his rifle to fire again, but the creature was already on him. It lunged from the shadows, its clawed hand swiping at him with impossible speed. The blow knocked the rifle from his hands and sent him sprawling to the ground. The creature loomed over him, its breath hot and rancid on his face. Jake tried to crawl backward, but the thing's clawed foot pinned him to the ground. It leaned in closer, its cold, dead eyes studying him with a hunger that chilled him to the bone. Jake's hand fumbled at his side, reaching for his hunting knife. His fingers closed around the hilt just as the creature's jaws opened, revealing sharp, blood-stained teeth. With a desperate cry, Jake drove the knife into the creature's side. The skinwalker let out a blood-curdling scream and recoiled, its body twisting in pain. Jake scrambled to his feet, adrenaline fueling his escape as he bolted toward the mouth of the canyon. Adam was waiting for him, rifle raised and eyes wide with fear. "Jake, hurry!" But as Jake reached his brother, the wind shifted, and the creature's growl echoed once more through the canyon. The shadows seemed to close in around them, and Jake realized with a sinking heart that this was only the beginning. The skinwalker wasn't finished with them. Not yet. The canyon was alive with shadows. As Jake and Adam fled, the wind whistled through the narrow crevices in the rocks, a hollow sound that mixed with the guttural growls of the skinwalker stalking them. Their horses were long gone, driven wild with fear, leaving the brothers on foot, vulnerable. The pale light of the moon barely penetrated the canyon's depths, casting everything in an otherworldly glow. Jake could hear Adam panting beside him as they ran, their boots kicking up dust and loose stones, the sound sharp in the unnatural quiet. "Faster!" Jake urged, glancing over his shoulder. His side throbbed where the skinwalker had struck him, but fear drove him forward. "We've got to reach the ridge." Adam nodded, but his face was pale, drawn with fear. "What good is the ridge gonna do?" he panted. "That thing. It's faster than us. We're not gonna outrun the thing." "We don't have to outrun it," Jake said, the desperation clear in his voice. "We just need a place to make a stand." His mind raced, trying to recall anything he'd ever heard about fighting a skinwalker. The old stories were vague, filled with warnings, not solutions. Silver bullets, sacred ground, something about fire, he muttered to himself, though none of that helped them now. Behind them, the low, rumbling growl echoed again, closer this time. The sound seemed to reverberate through the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell where the creature was lurking. Every shadow looked like it was about to leap at them. Every gust of wind sounded like claws scraping against rock. They reached a narrow passage where the canyon walls narrowed into a steep climb toward the ridge. Jake could see the jagged outline of the cliffs above them, a way out if they could reach it. But the creature was closing in, its movements barely audible over the wind, as if it was more shadow than flesh. "Up the rocks!" Jake shouted, pointing toward a steep incline. "We can lose it if we get to higher ground." Adam hesitated, looking back over his shoulder, his face pale with terror. "I don't know if we can." "Go," Jake barked, shoving him forward. "Just climb." The brothers scrambled up the incline, their hands gripping rough stone as they pulled themselves higher. The loose rock shifted beneath their feet, making the climb treacherous, but they didn't stop. The growls were closer now, the skinwalker moving with inhuman speed. Jake risked a glance back and froze. In the dim light, he could just make out the shape of the creature moving through the shadows below. It was faster than he had thought, its long limbs carrying it effortlessly across the rocky ground. Its eyes gleamed with that unnatural hunger, focused entirely on them. "We're not going to make it," Adam whispered, his voice cracking. "We will," Jake said through gritted teeth, though the doubt gnawed at him. They reached a ledge halfway up the cliffside, a small outcropping of rock that offered a brief respite. Jake turned, his breath ragged, and raised his rifle. He couldn't let the creature get any closer. He fired 2 shots in quick succession, the sound cracking through the canyon like thunder. The skinwalker dodged the first shot with a swift, unnatural movement, but the second bullet grazed its shoulder. It let out a bone-chilling screech, its body twisting in the moonlight as it retreated into the shadows. "Did you hit it?" Adam asked, his voice shaking as he pressed himself against the rock, trying to stay out of sight. "Just barely," Jake muttered, lowering the rifle. "It's still out there." As if in answer, the growl came again, more distant this time but still filled with that eerie malice. The skinwalker was stalking them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "We need to find shelter," Jake said, scanning the cliffs above them. "Somewhere we can get out of the open." Adam's eyes were wide, his breath coming in sharp bursts. "Jake, what if it's already too late? What if we're just delaying the inevitable?" Jake shook his head, his jaw clenched. "We're not giving up. There's got to be a way to stop it." But deep down, Jake knew his brother wasn't wrong. The stories of the skinwalker were never about victory. They were about survival, about barely escaping with your life, if you were lucky. And even then, the skinwalker always came back. As they climbed higher, the wind picked up, whipping through the narrow passage with a biting coldness. The sound of the growling had faded, but that only made Jake more nervous. The creature was toying with them, waiting until they were exhausted, vulnerable. They reached the top of the ridge just as the moon emerged from behind the clouds, casting a pale light over the desolate landscape. The canyon below stretched out like a labyrinth of jagged rocks and twisted trees, the darkness swallowing everything. Jake scanned the horizon, searching for some sign of shelter, some place where they could regroup and come up with a plan. His heart sank. There was nothing, just endless desert and rock, no sign of help or safety. "We'll have to keep moving," Jake said, turning to Adam. "If we stay here, it'll catch up to us." But Adam wasn't looking at him. His eyes were fixed on something in the distance, his face ashen. "Jake." Jake followed his brother's gaze and felt his blood run cold. There, standing on the ridge not far from them, was the skinwalker. Its body was hunched, its long limbs twisted in unnatural angles, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight. It had beaten them to the top. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the creature, his mind racing. The skinwalker stood perfectly still, watching them with an almost predatory patience. It didn't need to rush. It knew it had the advantage. "We need to move," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "Slowly. Don't turn your back on it." Adam nodded, his movements stiff with fear. The brothers began to back away, their eyes never leaving the skinwalker. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if amused by their efforts. It took a step forward, its body moving with an unsettling grace. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. They were running out of options. He raised his rifle again, but this time he wasn't sure it would do any good. The skinwalker had shrugged off their bullets like they were nothing. It was playing with them, enjoying the chase. "We're not gonna make it," Adam said, his voice cracking with panic. "Jake, we're not." Before he could finish, the skinwalker moved. It lunged toward them with terrifying speed, its claws outstretched. Jake fired his rifle, the shot echoing through the night, but the creature dodged effortlessly, its body twisting midair. In an instant, it was upon them. Jake barely had time to react. The skinwalker's claws raked across his arm, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he fought to stay conscious, his vision blurring as the creature loomed over him. "Jake!" Adam shouted, scrambling to pull his own rifle. But the skinwalker was too fast. It turned on Adam with a snarl, its eyes glowing with hunger. Desperate, Jake reached for his knife. His fingers closed around the hilt just as the skinwalker lunged at Adam. With a surge of adrenaline, Jake threw himself at the creature, driving the knife into its side with all the strength he had left. The skinwalker let out a screech, its body twisting in agony. It staggered back, blood dripping from the wound, but Jake knew it wasn't enough to kill it. The creature's eyes locked onto his, filled with a hatred that made his blood turn to ice. "Run!" Jake shouted to Adam, his voice hoarse. "Go." But as Adam stumbled backward, the skinwalker's gaze shifted, its eyes narrowing. Jake could see the decision in its movements, the cold calculation. It wasn't going to kill them yet. It was going to make them suffer. And then, with a growl that reverberated through the night, the skinwalker vanished into the shadows once more. The silence after the skinwalker's retreat was deafening. The wind seemed to hold its breath, and the world felt suspended, as if the canyon itself was waiting for something terrible to happen. Jake's arm throbbed where the skinwalker had clawed him, and he could feel the warmth of blood seeping through his shirt. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle against the sharp pain in his ribs. He glanced at Adam, who was crouched a few feet away, staring wide-eyed into the darkness where the creature had disappeared. "Adam," Jake called, his voice rough and weak. "You okay?" Adam didn't answer at first, his eyes still locked on the spot where the skinwalker had stood moments before. His face was pale, his body trembling with shock and fear. "Adam," Jake repeated, more forcefully this time. His brother snapped out of his daze and stumbled over to him, his movements unsteady. "Jake, you're hurt." "It's not that bad," Jake lied, though he could feel the sting of the wound deep in his arm. "We need to keep moving. That thing's still out there and it'll come back." Adam shook his head, panic rising in his voice. How? How are we supposed to fight that? We shot it, we stabbed it, and it barely even slowed down." Jake didn't have an answer. He felt the same sense of helplessness gnawing at him. The skinwalker was no ordinary predator. It wasn't something they could kill with a bullet or a knife. It was something far older, something that didn't play by the rules of the world they knew. But he couldn't let Adam see that fear. He had to keep his brother focused, keep him moving. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But first, we need to get out of this canyon. If we can find a safe spot to hole up, maybe we can come up with a plan." Adam helped Jake to his feet, his hands shaking. "But where? There's nothing out here, no shelter, no help. We're stranded in the middle of nowhere with that thing hunting us." Jake gritted his teeth, pushing past the pain. "We'll find something. Let's head north. The cliffs should thin out that way. If we can reach the open desert, it'll have a harder time ambushing us." Adam hesitated, his eyes darting toward the shadows again. "What if it's waiting for us out there?" Jake didn't answer. He didn't want to admit that Adam was right. The skinwalker could be anywhere, watching them from the darkness. But staying in one place was a death sentence. The creature was faster, stronger, and it knew the land better than they did. Their only chance was to keep moving, keep ahead of it. With Adam supporting him, Jake began to walk, each step a battle against the pain radiating from his wounds. The ridge stretched on before them, the jagged rocks and uneven terrain making it difficult to move quickly. The moon, still hanging low in the sky, offered little light, casting long, eerie shadows over the landscape. For a while, the only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the occasional gust of wind. But Jake knew the silence couldn't last. The skinwalker was out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. "Do you think we can outrun it?" Adam asked after a long stretch of silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake shook his head. "No. We can't outrun it and we can't outfight it, but maybe we can outsmart it." Adam glanced at him, the flicker of hope in his eyes quickly fading. How? That thing. It's like nothing I've ever seen. It's evil, Jake. Jake didn't argue. He'd felt it too. The malevolent force radiating from the creature, the sense that it was more than just a physical being. It was a predator, but it was also something worse, something tied to the land in a way they couldn't understand. We just need to survive the night, Jake said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure he believed them. The ground beneath their feet began to slope downward as they left the ridge and descended into a narrow valley. The cliffs on either side rose up like dark sentinels, the stars overhead barely visible through the narrow strip of sky. The wind had died down, leaving the air thick and still. Jake scanned the landscape, his eyes searching for any sign of shelter. His body was weakening, and he could feel the blood loss taking its toll. He knew they needed to find a place to rest soon, or risk collapsing where they stood. There, Adam said suddenly, pointing toward a cluster of rocks near the base of the cliff. We can hide out in there for a bit. Jake followed his brother's gaze. The rocks formed a small overhang, barely large enough for the two of them to crouch beneath, but it was better than being exposed out in the open. It wasn't much, but it would give them a chance to catch their breath. They hurried toward the shelter, their footsteps quickening with a new sense of urgency. Every second spent in the open felt like an invitation for the skinwalker to strike again. As they crouched beneath the rocky outcropping, Jake slumped against the stone, his breath ragged. He could feel his strength fading, the edges of his vision blurring as exhaustion and pain took hold. Adam knelt beside him, his face pale but determined. "Jake, you need to rest," Adam said quietly, his eyes darting around nervously. "You're losing too much blood." "I'll be fine," Jake muttered, though he knew it wasn't true. The wound was deeper than he had realized, and without proper treatment, infection was a real possibility. But there was no time to think about that now. They sat in silence for a few moments, the tension between them thick. Jake could feel the weight of the night pressing down on them, the knowledge that they were far from safety gnawing at him. The skinwalker was still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He could feel its presence, lurking in the shadows just beyond their sight. "Do you think it's GG1?" Adam asked hesitantly, his voice barely audible over the pounding of Jake's heartbeat in his ears. Jake shook his head. "No, it's still out there, it's just waiting." Adam's face twisted in frustration. "How do we stop it, Jake? There's gotta be something." Jake didn't answer right away. His mind raced, searching for any scrap of knowledge, any old story or tale that might hold the key to defeating the skinwalker. But all he had were fragments, old Navajo legends, half-remembered warnings about the creature's power and the ways it could be fought. "I don't know," Jake admitted finally, his voice heavy with defeat. "But we're not giving up yet." Adam nodded, though the fear in his eyes didn't fade. He kept his rifle close, his hands trembling slightly as he watched the darkness, waiting for the creature to make its move. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The silence was oppressive, the only sound the faint rustling of wind through the rocks. Jake's eyelids grew heavy, the pain in his arm dulling as exhaustion crept over him. But just as he was about to drift into a fitful sleep, a sound pierced the stillness. A soft rhythmic tapping. Jake's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to Adam, who had gone rigid, his eyes wide with terror. The tapping came again, closer this time. It was the sound of claws scraping against stone. The skinwalker had found them. The tapping echoed through the narrow canyon, sharp and deliberate, like a predator teasing its prey. Jake's pulse quickened as he pressed himself deeper into the rocky overhang, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The shadows played tricks on him, twisting and shifting, but there was no mistaking the sound. The skinwalker was close. Adam's breath was shallow beside him, his hands gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The tapping stopped for a moment, and a tense silence filled the air. "Jake," Adam whispered, his voice trembling. "What do we do?" Jake clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his fear in check. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped in the narrow valley, the cliffs towering over them on either side, and the skinwalker knew it. "We wait," Jake whispered back, his voice tight. "Stay quiet. Don't move." The wind shifted, carrying a faint, foul odor, like rotting meat mixed with damp earth. Jake's stomach churned at the scent. It was the smell of the skinwalker, close enough now that the air itself felt heavy with its presence. The creature was toying with them, drawing out the fear, savoring it. Jake had heard the stories growing up, tales of how the skinwalker thrived on terror, how it fed on the fear and suffering of its victims before it finally struck. A low growl rumbled through the canyon, soft but menacing. Jake's grip on his rifle tightened, his finger hovering over the trigger. The sound came from behind them, but in the darkness, It was impossible to pinpoint the exact location. "Where is it?" Adam whispered, his voice barely audible. Jake shook his head, unable to answer. He could feel the skinwalker watching them, studying them, but it remained hidden in the shadows. Its presence more a feeling than something he could see. Suddenly, there was a flicker of movement to their left, just a brief glimpse of something dark and fast. Adam gasped, raising his rifle, but Jake grabbed his arm. "Don't," Jake hissed. "It's trying to make you shoot." Adam's eyes were wild with fear, but he lowered the rifle, his body trembling. "I can't take this, Jake. It's playing with us." Jake knew exactly how Adam felt. The tension was unbearable, every second dragging out like an eternity. The skinwalker's patience was terrifying. It didn't need to rush. It had all the time in the world to wear them down, to exhaust them before it finally struck. Then, out of the darkness came a voice. "Jake." "Adam." It was soft, almost melodic, and completely wrong. The sound of their names coming from that thing sent a shiver down Jake's spine. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was a perfect mimic of their father's voice. "Come on, boys, it's safe." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the voice floated through the air, the tone warm and inviting, just like their father had sounded when calling them in for dinner as kids. Adam's breath hitched. "No, that's not real." The voice came again, this time from behind them. "Come home, boys. It's time." "Don't listen to it," Jake warned, though his own resolve was faltering. The skinwalker could do more than just stalk, it could mimic, could deceive. It was trying to draw them out, to make them question reality. The voice shifted again, this time becoming their mother's. "Adam." Jake, Doc, come here. It's okay. You're safe now." Adam's eyes filled with tears as he shook his head violently, as though trying to clear his mind. I know that's not real, Jake, but." "I know," Jake said, his voice firm but sympathetic. "I know, Adam. It's just trying to break us. You have to hold on." But even as he said it, Jake could feel the strain on his own sanity. The skinwalker's games were worse than its physical attacks. The way it used their own memories, their loved ones' voices, was like an assault on their minds. Jake had never imagined it would be this hard to resist. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack to their right, the sound of stone breaking. Both brothers snapped toward the noise, their rifles raised, but there was nothing there. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, hiding the creature from view. The growl came again, this time low and guttural, echoing from all directions. And then, out of the darkness, a shape emerged. The skinwalker stepped into the faint light of the moon, its twisted form more terrifying than Jake had remembered. Its body was gaunt and elongated, the limbs too long, the joints bending at unnatural angles. Its skin was a mottled gray, and its face, a grotesque mix of human and animal features, was a mask of pure malice. Its eyes, glowing faintly, locked onto them, filled with hunger and hatred. For a moment, the creature simply stood there, watching them. The air between them seemed to thicken with tension. Adam, barely able to hold himself together, whispered, "What now?" Jake's mind raced. They couldn't outrun it. They couldn't fight it, but there had to be something. His eyes flicked to the knife strapped to his belt, the one he had used earlier. The skinwalker had reacted to it, if only slightly. Then it hit him. The stories. The Navajo legends. The only thing more powerful than the skinwalker was the land itself, the sacred ground, the earth imbued with the spiritual energy of the ancestors. "Adam," Jake said, his voice urgent but steady, "we need to find sacred ground." Adam stared at him, confusion and fear clouding his face. "What are you talking about?" "The stories," Jake said quickly, glancing at the skinwalker, which was still watching them with unnerving calm. "It can't be killed, but it can be weakened, on sacred ground. We need to find a place like that, a place where the old ways still have power." Adam's face went pale. "How are we supposed to find that in the middle of nowhere?" "I don't know," Jake admitted, "but it's our only chance." The skinwalker let out a low rumbling growl, and then, without warning, it lunged at them. Jake didn't hesitate. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Adam's arm and pulling him toward the narrow path that led deeper into the canyon. They sprinted, their feet pounding against the rough terrain, the skinwalker's snarls echoing behind them. The creature moved with terrifying speed, its claws scraping against the rocks as it closed the distance. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as they rounded a bend in the canyon, their eyes frantically scanning the landscape for any sign of salvation. The cliffs loomed high above them, and the path ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Jake saw something, a faint glow in the distance, barely visible in the darkness. There, he shouted, pointing. We have to go that way. Adam didn't question him. They veered off the main path, running toward the distant glow. As they drew closer, Jake realized what it was. A small, weathered stone circle, etched with symbols he didn't recognize. It looked ancient, forgotten, but there was something about it that felt right. They stumbled into the circle just as the skinwalker reached them, its growls turning into a furious snarl. But as the creature lunged at them, it hesitated. Its eyes flicked to the stones, and for the first time, Jake saw something in its gaze that looked like fear. The skinwalker stepped back, its lips curling in a hiss of frustration. The ground beneath Jake and Adam's feet seemed to pulse with energy, and though Jake didn't fully understand it, he knew they had found what they needed. The creature paced at the edge of the circle, its glowing eyes locked on them, but it didn't cross the boundary. Jake, breathing hard, glanced at Adam. We're not safe yet, he said, his voice strained. But this will give us time. The skinwalker howled into the night, its anger reverberating through the canyon. It wouldn't give up. Not yet. The skinwalker's howls echoed through the canyon, filling the air with an almost physical force. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the creature pace just outside the stone circle. Its glowing eyes never left them, and though it hesitated to cross the boundary, Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the skinwalker found a way in. Adam was slumped against one of the stones, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His face was pale, and his hand still trembled from the chase. Jake. What is this place? Jake shook his head, his mind racing to make sense of it all. I don't know. It's old. Older than anything we've seen out here. He knelt down to examine the carvings on the stones, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns etched into the rock. The symbols were worn with age, but there was something about them that felt powerful, like they were part of an ancient, forgotten magic. He looked up at Adam, who was staring warily at the skinwalker. This might be the sacred ground we need. Adam nodded, though the fear in his eyes hadn't faded. You really think it'll keep that thing out? For now, Jake said, though he wasn't sure how long the protection would last. The skinwalker's fury was palpable, and he could feel the creature's frustration growing with each passing second. We need to figure out how to end this. We can't stay here forever. The wind began to pick up, swirling dust and sand through the canyon. The skinwalker let out a low growl, its claws scraping the ground as it circled them, testing the boundaries of the ancient magic. Every time it got too close, the air seemed to hum with energy, pushing it back, but it was clear that the creature was relentless. Adam's eyes darted nervously to the stones surrounding them. What if this thing breaks? What if it finds a way in? Jake didn't answer. He didn't have any guarantees, and the tension was getting to him as well. He stared out at the skinwalker, trying to think of anything that could give them an advantage. The stories, the legends, there had to be something. The Navajo had fought these creatures before, but the knowledge had been buried under centuries of fear and secrecy. His mind flashed back to a conversation he had once overheard between two Navajo elders in a trading post. They had spoken in hushed tones about the skinwalkers, about how their power could be severed from the land. Jake hadn't understood it at the time, but now, with the creature so close, the memory took on new meaning. Adam, Jake said suddenly, his voice urgent. The land, it's connected to the skinwalker. The stories talk about severing that connection. If we can break its link to the land, maybe we can stop it. Adam looked at him, his face a mix of hope and desperation. How? What do we need to do? Jake scanned the stones around them, his mind racing. The carvings, they were symbols of protection, of power, meant to keep evil at bay. But there was more to it than just protection. These symbols were part of something bigger, something that bound the skinwalker to this place. We need to disrupt its connection, Jake said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The stones, they're keeping it out, but they're also holding something in. I think this place is part of the skinwalker's power. If we destroy the stones, it might weaken it. Adam's eyes widened in disbelief. You want to destroy the only thing keeping us safe? Jake hesitated. It sounded crazy, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the only way. The skinwalker was tied to this land, to the ancient power that ran through the stones. If they could disrupt that, maybe they could sever its control. I don't think we have a choice, Jake said, his voice grim. The stones are holding it back, but they're also feeding it. We need to cut off its power. Adam swallowed hard, his gaze shifting from Jake to the skinwalker and back again. And if you're wrong? Jake didn't answer. He didn't have the luxury of certainty. He could feel time running out, the skinwalker's presence pressing in on them, its malevolent energy thickening the air. They had to act, and they had to do it now. Taking a deep breath, Jake grabbed a rock from the ground and stood, his legs shaky but determined. He stepped toward one of the carved stones, his grip tightening around the makeshift weapon. "Jake," Adam said, his voice filled with fear. "Are you sure?" "No," Jake admitted, glancing back at him. "But it's the only shot we've got." With one swift motion, Jake brought the rock down on the stone pillar. The sound of the impact rang through the canyon, and a crack appeared in the surface of the stone, spiderwebbing outward. The moment the stone cracked, the air seemed to shift. The energy that had been humming around them faltered, and the skinwalker let out a low, guttural snarl. Its eyes blazed with anger, and it took a step closer to the circle, testing the boundary again. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The skinwalker was getting closer. "Keep going," Adam shouted, his voice filled with panic. Jake raised the rock again and brought it down harder this time, shattering the stone completely. As the pieces fell to the ground, a low rumble reverberated through the earth, and the energy that had been holding the skinwalker at bay seemed to dissipate. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the skinwalker let out a blood-curdling scream, a sound so horrifying that it made Jake's blood run cold. The creature's body convulsed, its form twisting and warping in unnatural ways as it staggered toward the circle. It was no longer restrained by the ancient magic, but something was wrong. Its movements were erratic, its strength seemingly drained. The connection was breaking. "Jake, look," Adam shouted, pointing at the skinwalker. The creature's body began to disintegrate, the flesh peeling away like ash in the wind. It howled in fury, thrashing wildly as the land rejected it. The stones had been its anchor, its source of power, and now, with the circle broken, it was losing its hold on this world. Jake watched in awe as the skinwalker's form dissolved, its body shrinking and collapsing in on itself. It let out one final, furious scream before disappearing completely, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. For a long moment, neither Jake nor Adam moved. The canyon was eerily still, the oppressive weight of the skinwalker's presence finally lifted. "It's gone," Adam said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake exhaled, the tension in his body slowly releasing as the realization sank in. They had done it. They had broken the creature's connection to the land, and in doing so, had destroyed it. But the victory felt hollow. The cost of confronting the skinwalker, the sheer terror they had endured, had left them both shaken to their cores. The scars of this night would remain with them forever. Jake collapsed onto the ground, his body exhausted and his mind reeling. Adam sat down beside him, his face pale and drawn. For a while they sat in silence, staring at the place where the skinwalker had once stood. Finally, Adam broke the silence. "What now?" Jake looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling faintly above them. The night felt less oppressive now, less hostile, but the weight of what they had faced lingered in the air. "We go home," Jake said, though the word felt foreign in his mouth. Home didn't seem like the same place anymore, not after everything they had seen, everything they had survived. Adam nodded, his eyes still fixed on the spot where the skinwalker had vanished. "Yeah, home." But as they stood to leave, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The skinwalker was gone, but the land itself still held secrets, dark, ancient secrets that had yet to be uncovered. And deep down, Jake knew that they hadn't seen the last of the evil that lurked in these canyons. The journey back home felt surreal. The canyon, once so threatening, was now eerily quiet. As Jake and Adam made their way out of the narrow passage, the night air felt cooler, lighter somehow. As if the skinwalker's presence had poisoned it, and now it was finally free. But Jake's mind was anything but at ease. The land still felt heavy beneath his feet, like it held secrets deeper than they could ever understand. And as the brothers walked in silence, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Even though the skinwalker had dissolved into ash and shadow, something lingered, an echo of its presence, a dark stain on the world that refused to fade. By the time they reached the edge of the canyon, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the desert. The sight should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Instead, Jake felt a gnawing sense of unease growing inside him. "Jake," Adam said, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse, filled with exhaustion. What if it wasn't the only one? Jake stopped walking, turning to face his brother. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with dread. Adam's face was pale, his eyes dark with fear. The same fear that Jake had been pushing down since the skinwalker's death. What do you mean? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Adam swallowed hard, glancing back at the canyon, as if expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. What if there are more? What if that thing wasn't the only skinwalker out there? Jake didn't want to think about it, but he couldn't deny the possibility. The stories they had grown up hearing spoke of many skinwalkers, not just one. These creatures were ancient, bound to the land in ways no one fully understood. Killing one didn't mean they were safe. It didn't mean the nightmare was over. We can't live like this, Adam continued, his voice shaking. Always looking over our shoulders, wondering if something's going to come for us next. Jake nodded slowly, his mind racing. We need answers. We need to understand what we're dealing with. Adam stared at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fear. What are you saying? You want to go looking for more of these things? No, Jake said, shaking his head. But we need to learn. We barely survived this one because we didn't know enough. If there are more out there, we can't just wait for them to come to us. Adam was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the ground. Finally, he nodded. You're right. We need to talk to someone who knows more about this. Someone who understands these creatures. Jake's thoughts immediately went to the Navajo elders, the ones who had spoken of the skinwalkers in hushed whispers. They had known more than they let on, more than they were willing to share. But after what they had faced, Jake was determined to find out the truth. We go to the reservation, Jake said, his voice steady. The elders know the stories, the old ways. They'll have answers. Adam nodded, though his face was still pale, his body tense with the fear that had been building inside him since the skinwalker had first appeared. And if they don't, what then? Jake didn't answer. He didn't want to think about the possibility that even the elders wouldn't have the answers they needed. But deep down, he knew that no matter what they learned, they were forever changed. The world wasn't the same place it had been before, and neither were they. The brothers continued walking, their steps slower now as they moved away from the canyon and toward the dirt road that would lead them back home. But even as the sun rose higher in the sky, illuminating the vast desert, the sense of unease never left them. The land felt alive beneath their feet, like it was watching, waiting. There was a heaviness in the air that Jake couldn't shake, a lingering darkness that clung to them like a shadow. When they finally reached the road, they climbed into Jake's truck, the worn seats and dusty dashboard offering a small sense of normalcy. But as Jake turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. Great, Adam muttered, slumping back in his seat. Jake tried again, but the truck refused to start. The engine groaned, coughing out a few weak sputters before going silent. This day just keeps getting better, Adam said, glancing around the empty desert. Jake slammed his hand against the steering wheel, frustration bubbling up inside him. But before he could try the engine again, something caught his eye, a figure standing in the distance, barely visible against the rising sun. At first, Jake thought it was a trick of the light, but as the figure moved closer, his heart began to race. It was an old man, his body draped in a long, tattered robe, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, as if he had all the time in the world. Jake and Adam exchanged uneasy glances. Who the hell is that? Adam asked, his voice low. I don't know, Jake replied, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The old man drew closer, his movements unnervingly calm, until he was standing just a few feet from the truck. His face was weathered, his skin like cracked leather, and his eyes, dark, sunken hollows, seemed to pierce right through them. You've seen it, the old man said, his voice raspy and dry, like the wind over sand. Haven't you? Jake's throat tightened, but he forced himself to nod. The skinwalker, the old man's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no warmth in it. The land remembers. It always does. Adam shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Who are you? The old man tilted his head, his gaze never leaving Jake's. I am a keeper of stories, of truths long forgotten by most. The skinwalker is not gone. It never truly leaves. Jake felt a chill crawl down his spine. What do you mean? We destroyed it. We broke the stones. The old man's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. You severed its connection, yes. But the land is old, and the spirits of the land are older still. The skinwalker is bound to this place, to the earth itself. It may fade, but it will return. It always returns. Jake's heart sank. He had hoped that destroying the skinwalker had put an end to it, but the old man's words confirmed what he had feared all along. Adam shook his head, his voice rising with frustration. So what are we supposed to do? Just wait for it to come back? The old man looked at him, his gaze steady and calm. You seek answers, but the answers you seek are not easily given. The skinwalker is a force of nature, a balance of light and shadow. To truly defeat it, you must understand the land, the spirits, and the old ways. Jake leaned forward, his hands gripping the steering wheel. How do we stop it for good? The old man's eyes glinted with something unreadable. To stop it, you must become part of the land. You must seek out the sacred places, the places where the power of the ancestors still runs deep. Only there can you find the strength to face what is coming. Jake and Adam exchanged a glance, the weight of the old man's words sinking in. There's more out there, isn't there? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man nodded slowly. Yes, the skinwalker is only one of many. The land is full of spirits, both good and bad. The balance is delicate, and when that balance is disturbed, the darkness grows stronger. Jake swallowed hard. And we've disturbed it, haven't we? The old man's expression softened slightly, though there was no comfort in his gaze. Yes. But you are not without hope. The land may be dangerous, but it also offers protection to those who seek it with respect. The path ahead is difficult, but it is not impossible. The old man turned and began to walk away, his figure slowly fading into the distance. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Jake and Adam sat in silence, the weight of the old man's words hanging heavy in the air. The skinwalker was gone, but the darkness wasn't finished with them yet. The old man's cryptic words hung in the air long after he disappeared into the desert haze. Jake sat behind the wheel, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. Adam was silent in the passenger seat, his eyes staring blankly at the horizon. Jake's mind raced with 1,000 questions. The land, the spirits, the skinwalker, it was all so much, more than they had ever imagined. They hadn't just survived a nightmare, they had stepped into something ancient and powerful, something they barely understood. Do you think he's right? Adam's voice broke the silence, his tone heavy with uncertainty. Jake exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel. I don't know. But he knew about the skinwalker. He knew what we went through. That has to mean something. Adam nodded, though the unease in his eyes remained. So what do we do now? We can't just sit here and wait for it to come back. Jake shook his head, his jaw tightening with determination. We don't wait. We go to the sacred places the old man talked about. If the land holds answers, that's where we'll find them. How do we even know where to start? Adam asked, his voice rising with frustration. This land is massive, and we're not exactly experts on ancient Navajo sites. Jake stared out at the desert, the vast expanse of red earth and jagged rock stretching endlessly in every direction. He didn't have an answer, not yet, but they couldn't afford to do nothing. The old man's warning was clear, the skinwalker was still out there, and it wasn't the only threat lurking in the shadows. We find the elders, Jake said finally. The Navajo elders. They know the land better than anyone. They'll know where to go. Adam hesitated, his brow furrowing. And you think they'll help us? After what we did, after everything? Jake glanced at his brother, the weight of guilt settling in his chest. They had disturbed something ancient, something sacred, and they had paid the price. But if they had any hope of stopping the skinwalker from returning, they needed the knowledge that only the elders could provide. We don't have a choice, Jake said. We tell them the truth, we tell them what happened, and we ask for their help. Adam nodded reluctantly, though the tension in his body hadn't eased. All right. But we'd better be careful. People don't just talk about skinwalkers, they'll think we're crazy. Jake didn't respond, his mind already focused on the next step. He turned the key in the ignition again, and this time, the engine roared to life. The truck rumbled forward, and they began the long drive back to the nearest town, the weight of their mission heavy in the air. Hours later, they arrived at the edge of the Navajo reservation, the dry, dusty landscape stretching out before them. The small town was quiet, the streets nearly empty, save for a few people going about their daily routines. Jake parked the truck near the trading post, where he remembered seeing the two elders years ago. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. As they stepped out of the truck, Adam glanced around uneasily. You sure about this? Jake nodded, though his own nerves were on edge. He didn't know how the elders would react to their story, but they couldn't turn back now. They had seen the darkness firsthand, and they knew it wasn't finished with them. The trading post was dimly lit, the scent of burning sage filling the air as they entered. Shelves lined with handcrafted pottery, jewelry, and blankets filled the space, but Jake's attention was focused on the back of the room, where two older men sat at a small table, their voices low as they spoke in Navajo. Jake approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. One of the elders looked up, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jake and Adam. The lines on his face were deep, his skin weathered by years of living in the harsh desert. There was wisdom in his gaze, but also a quiet intensity, as if he had seen far more than he ever let on. "Can we help you?" the elder asked, his voice rough but calm. Jake swallowed, his throat dry. "I don't know if you'll believe us, but we need your help. We've seen something. Something we shouldn't have." The elder's eyes didn't waver, but Jake could sense the tension in the room shift. The other elder leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "What have you seen?" the second elder asked, his tone sharper. Jake hesitated for a moment, then spoke the word he had been dreading. "A skinwalker." The air in the room grew heavy, the silence between them thick with unspoken fear. The elders exchanged a glance, their expressions darkening. "Skinwalkers are not something you should speak of lightly," the first elder said, his voice low. "They are not a story for outsiders to tell." "We know," Jake said quickly. "We didn't mean to. We didn't understand what we were getting into, but we saw it. It came after us. And now we need to know how to stop it from coming back." The second elder leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You say you saw the skinwalker, and you lived?" Jake nodded. "We destroyed its connection to the land. At least we think we did. But someone told us it wasn't gone for good. That it will come back." The first elder's expression hardened, his eyes locking onto Jake's. "You have disturbed something ancient, something dangerous. The land holds many spirits, both good and bad, and when you interfere with that balance, you invite chaos." Jake clenched his fists, frustration boiling up inside him. "We didn't mean to. We were just trying to survive." The elder studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Survival is not a crime, but the path you are on is dangerous. The skinwalker you encountered is part of a much larger web, a web that spans generations. To stop it, you must sever its ties to the land completely. That is not an easy task." Adam shifted uneasily beside Jake. "How do we do that? How do we sever its ties?" The elder sighed, his gaze distant. "There are sacred places, places where the spirits of the land are strong. These places are hidden, protected by the ancestors. Only there can you find the power to stop the skinwalker. But be warned, those who seek such places often do not return." Jake's heart sank, but he nodded. "We don't have a choice. We have to try." The elder looked at him, his eyes filled with something Jake couldn't quite place, pity perhaps, or maybe understanding. "Very well. I will tell you where to go. But know this, the path ahead is not just dangerous. It is a test. The land will judge you, and if you are found unworthy, it will not show mercy." Jake's throat tightened, but he nodded. "We understand." The elder stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as if every step carried the weight of centuries. He reached for a worn map on the wall, tracing a path with his finger. "Here," he said, pointing to a spot deep within the desert. "This is where you must go. The place is sacred, and the spirits there will reveal what you need to do. But be careful. The skinwalker is not your only enemy. The land itself will test you." Jake and Adam exchanged a glance, the enormity of the task sinking in. They were venturing into uncharted territory, where ancient spirits and forgotten powers waited for them. But there was no turning back now. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice quiet. The elder nodded, his eyes somber. "May the ancestors guide you." As Jake and Adam left the trading post, the weight of the mission ahead settled over them like a heavy cloak. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The sacred place the elder had shown them was deep in the wilderness, far from any town or road. They had faced the skinwalker and survived, but now they were heading into something far older, far more dangerous. And Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The drive to the sacred place was long, the roads becoming rougher and less defined the farther Jake and Adam ventured into the desert. The sun had begun to dip behind the jagged peaks of distant mountains, casting the world into twilight. The shadows grew longer, and the once familiar landscape felt foreign, almost hostile. Jake gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the horizon as they neared the area the elder had marked on the map. The land stretched endlessly before them, the silence unnerving. A sense of dread gnawed at him. The old man had warned them that the land itself would test them, and Jake could feel it. Something ancient, something alive, watching them. "Are we close?" Adam asked, his voice tense. Jake glanced at the map in his lap, the faint outline of the path the elder had drawn barely visible in the fading light. "Almost. Just a few more miles." The land was vast, its emptiness overwhelming, and as they drove deeper into the wilderness, it felt as though the world itself was shrinking, the sky pressing down on them. They were heading into the heart of something sacred and dangerous, and they were not welcome. They reached the end of the dirt road, where the truck could go no farther. A narrow footpath, barely visible through the scrub, wound its way up toward a distant ridge. Beyond that ridge lay the place the elder had spoken of, the place where they would find their answers, or meet their end. Jake and Adam climbed out of the truck, the oppressive silence of the desert surrounding them. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the very earth was holding its breath. "You ready for this?" Jake asked, though the question felt hollow. Adam looked at him, fear flickering in his eyes. "Not really. But we've come this far." Together they began their ascent, the path winding higher and higher into the hills. The darkness deepened, and the stars began to emerge in the sky, but their light offered little comfort. Every step felt heavier, as if the land itself was resisting their passage. As they reached the top of the ridge, a sight unfolded before them, a vast hidden valley, untouched by time. The air here felt different, charged with an energy neither of them could explain. At the center of the valley stood a circle of towering stones, ancient and weathered by centuries of wind and sun. This was the place, the sacred place, but it wasn't empty. Jake's heart clenched as his eyes fell upon a figure standing in the center of the stone circle. The silhouette was tall and thin, its form wrapped in shadows, the air around it shimmering with an unnatural energy. "The Skinwalker," Adam whispered, his voice barely audible. Jake felt a cold dread settle over him, but he forced himself to step forward. "It can't be. We destroyed it." The figure didn't move, but the air grew colder, the wind picking up as it howled through the stones. The presence of the Skinwalker was undeniable. It was here, waiting for them, just as the old man had warned. The land was testing them. As they approached the stone circle, Jake's pulse quickened. His mind raced with memories of the first encounter, the speed, the terror, the overwhelming power of the creature. But this time they were prepared. This time they had a purpose. The Skinwalker's form shifted in the moonlight, its shape blurring and changing, as if it existed on the edge of reality itself. It stood between them and the center of the circle, a silent sentinel, guarding the ancient power that lay within. Jake reached into his pack, his fingers brushing against the smooth, cold surface of the stones the elder had given them, sacred talismans meant to protect them from the Skinwalker's influence. He handed one to Adam, who took it with shaking hands. "We have to be strong," Jake said, his voice steady but strained. "Remember what the elder said. This is a test. We can't let it break us." Adam nodded, though fear still gripped him. Together they stepped into the stone circle, the ground beneath their feet feeling more solid, more alive than anywhere they had been before. The Skinwalker moved then, its form shifting as it turned toward them, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming, a force of pure malice and ancient power. The air around them crackled with energy, and the ground seemed to hum beneath their feet. Jake and Adam stood their ground, the talismans clutched tightly in their hands. They had come this far, they couldn't turn back now. The Skinwalker moved closer, its form flickering and changing, the sound of its footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. But as it neared the center of the circle, something shifted. The ground trembled, and the air grew heavy with the scent of earth and sage. Suddenly, the stones around them began to glow, a soft, pulsing light emanating from their ancient surfaces. The power of the land was awakening, responding to the presence of the intruders. Jake's heart raced. This was it, the moment the elder had warned them about. The land was judging them, testing their resolve, their worthiness. And the Skinwalker, the embodiment of the land's darkness, was part of that test. The creature lunged, its form shifting into something monstrous, part animal, part shadow. But as it moved toward Jake, the light from the stones grew brighter, creating a barrier between them. The Skinwalker howled in fury, its form rippling as it slammed against the invisible wall of energy. Jake felt a surge of hope. The talismans were working, the power of the land protecting them. But it wasn't enough. The Skinwalker was relentless, its attacks growing more frenzied with each passing moment. "We have to finish this," Jake shouted over the howling wind. "We have to sever its connection to the land completely." Adam looked at him, panic in his eyes. "How?" Jake's mind raced, the words of the elder echoing in his head. The sacred places, the ancestors, the spirits of the land. They had to tap into the power of the land itself, the power that lay dormant within the stones. Without thinking, Jake knelt down and pressed his hand against the ground. the talisman in his other hand glowing with a soft, warm light. He closed his eyes, focusing on the energy beneath him, the ancient power that pulsed through the earth. He could feel it now, alive and strong, waiting to be called upon. "Adam, do the same!" Jake shouted, his voice strained. Adam hesitated, but then followed suit, pressing his hand to the ground beside Jake. Together, they reached out with their minds, connecting to the energy of the land, the spirits that watched over it. The wind howled louder, the ground trembling beneath them as the stones around the circle flared with light. The skinwalker let out a piercing scream, its form distorting as it fought against the rising power of the land. And then, in a blinding flash of light, the connection was severed. The skinwalker's form shattered, dissolving into ash and shadow, its scream echoing through the valley, before fading into silence. The air stilled, the light from the stones dimming as the energy of the land settled once more. Jake and Adam remained kneeling, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The skinwalker was gone, truly gone this time. They had severed its connection to the land, and the balance had been restored. Slowly they stood, the weight of their victory sinking in. The valley was quiet now, peaceful, as if the land itself was thanking them for their actions. The test was over. "We did it," Adam whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Jake nodded, his body trembling with exhaustion. "Yeah, we did." As they made their way back down the ridge, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting the desert in a soft, golden glow. The darkness had been driven back, and for the first time in days, Jake felt a sense of peace. The skinwalker was no more, and the land was safe. For now,